When you're thinking about a bottom line or whatever you're trying to say, a point, is it meaningful? Is it memorable? Can it move you to action?
If it's your bottom line, it really should be able to matter in the grand scheme of the talk.
It is possible. It just requires a lot of work. Welcome back to the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast. My name's Ashley, and I'm so excited to talk today about one of the things I am most passionate about, communicating to students, but not just communicating to students, communicating to a combined room of middle and high schoolers. But before we jump in to this fantastic conversation, I want you to meet the amazing, brilliant minds we have in the room with us today. Yes. I'm throwing it across.
Hey,
at the queen.
I'm Leslie. Hi. I didn't rehearse this. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. Hi, what's up? I'm Leslie. I'm the Senior Vice President of Life Stages at Orange, which means I get to lead 4 of our curriculum teams, one of our studio teams, lots of fun stuff. My kind of journey of communicating with students, I grew up in a small church for the first 30 years of my life. And like when I was in middle school, I was talking to the kids, and then when I was in high school I was talking to the middle schoolers, and then when I got to college I was talking to the high schoolers. So it's like,
that's how they do it.
You just start when you start. So I got the opportunity to work in a really, really small church for the beginning most of my life, and then I moved to one of the really, really large churches. Like I think they're at 47 campuses across the US right now.
Yeah, you're right.
And then I'm here in Orange. So and then camps and conferences and things like that.
Well, let's just jump to my immediate left.
Yup, and that's me, Jamel Jones. Spelled Jamal, pronounced Jamel. No, it's not a typo that you see on the screen, and don't worry, I'll tell you the story later. So, I was a student pastor for 6 years full-time, but I've been communicating to middle schoolers and high schoolers since I was in middle school, y'all. It's crazy. They let me speak at youth group when I was in like 7th grade. It was crazy. So I've been communicating for a relatively long time. All groups, middle schoolers only, high schoolers only. Both of them together, which I actually did more than not. So I'm really hyped to share all the tips and the tricks and then learn from the homies about how to do it too. So,
and just to be clear, you still communicate to students.
That's correct. Not as often as I like to, because, things and happen. But the homies invite me to, to the camps and stuff. So I still be doing it. Still be helping out the homies. I'd be watching their talks and stuff. So yeah,
cool.
Still at it.
Glad you're here.
Same.
So I'm homie Griff. My name is Derek Griffon, a.k.a. Griff. Yes, I took Griff from my last name and made it my nickname, and it stuck. But I'm a local student pastor at the Bayou Church in Lafayette, Louisiana. I've been in student ministry for 14 years. And I get to travel and speak across the nation at Disciple Now's camps, conferences, all those kind of things. And most of the time, it's always in a room with combined middle school and high school students. Also a writer, author, speaker. It's just an honor to be on this podcast with the homies, as Jamel said.
Yes, it's true.
Well, let's just jump right in. It's no secret to anyone listening that communicating to a combined room of middle and high schoolers is a challenge, in my humble opinion. I think it's the hardest group to communicate to.
Ooh.
I mean, like when you have a room full of just middle schoolers, it's like squirrels everywhere, And high schoolers, it's like, do they like you at all?
More like cats, I guess.
And then combined, you got it all.
Squirrels and cats together?
I feel like it requires more prep, more time, more skill. And so I'm so excited to be having this conversation because the reality is that at some point, if not weekly, you will be communicating to a combined group of middle and high schoolers, whether it's for events or weekly programming, or you parent both middle and high schoolers.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about it. What's something you're rethinking? I'm starting with you, Griff.
Yeah.
You look like you have something important to say about this
No.
topic. Okay.
I'm excited. I didn't know you were coming to me, but let's do it.
Let's do it. What's something you're rethinking about communicating to a combined room of middle and high schoolers?
One of the things that I think I'm rethinking, and the reason I'm rethinking is as long as I've been doing this, is I'm also our second teaching pastor at the church.
Ooh,
so
flex.
not only do I communicate to middle school and high school students, but I get to communicate to 6 generations on one Sunday. That was a John Maxwell quote, because he says if you're talking to that many people, there's probably, especially in the church, 6 generations. So for me now, when I go back from communicating to an entire church to communicating to middle school and high schoolers, I've learned how different it really is. because you go from doing it all middle school and high school to now you're doing it more in front of a church, back to that. I think one of the things I'm rethinking is the engagement. The book that you wrote, Ashley, has really helped with that, because it's made me think about how middle schoolers think more concrete and how high schoolers think more abstract. And that for me, as powerful as I know that my voice can be, or obnoxious, whichever one you choose.
We're gonna say powerful.
We'll go with that. And as engaging as I know I can be, I know that sometimes it can be easy to lose them without some type of illustration, without some type of prop. And so I've been rethinking how I utilize images and props. I mean, just recently, 3 weeks ago, I used a water bottle and used it as a kind of a mist of how our lives are here and then they're gone. And it really resonated with a lot of the students in there. I'm like, okay, well, objects are necessary. I use them every now and then, but I'm rethinking about how do I use it more. Stuart Hall, who's actually on staff with Orange Leaders, you know, he does a great job of bringing it all together with images, movie clips, objects and props. And sometimes, I'm gonna be real, as loud as I can be, I can also be lazy and not want to plan anything extra, because you know what I'm saying? Because sometimes your talent and sometimes the things you do, you can try to overcompensate, or you're like, well, I'm not going to work on those weaknesses. So I'm trying to rethink, how can I utilize my strengths, but also work on the things that I'm not good at to re-engage students. And so
for context, do you teach weekly to a combined room of middle high
Yes.
schoolers? Okay.
Yes.
6th through 12th grade.
6th through 12th grade.
Okay.
6th through 12th grade every Sunday night. My associate speaks sometimes, but I'm our main consistent communicator. Yes.
So would you say that you are trying to use more illustrations and props and things like that? What's the reason behind it?
Engagement, because their attention spans are so lost. Also, once again, props and images, man, they can communicate and paint a picture of what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
So as direct as I am as a communicator, when I believe and think, like, no, I'm sure they're stepping with me because I got their eyes. It doesn't mean it's clicking.
Yep.
But I noticed that with images and stories or illustrations,
Yep.
man, it brings it to life. It brings it to life.
So let me take us to the next level then. If you're trying to plan more of those in your talks, what is the process you think through to make sure you're hitting a 6th grader and a 12th grader in those illustrations?
Very good question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Ask them all to you too.
Yeah,
I'm
you,
just-
guys can jump in anytime you want, but we just dive in.
I'm gonna give you a second. Just
Come
to
on,
think,
yeah,
you know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
absolutely, yeah.
So, you brought up the first thing I go to when I think about how to find a prop. Let's say a prop, and by prop we mean like a thing. At least I do. Like, you know,
An
there's
object lesson.
Yeah, there's different tools you can utilize, but I think, let's just say it's a thing, right? You're trying to have a physical object to have with you to illustrate the point, right? And so if I'm thinking about how it works best with middle schoolers, we're going to go to what is in general different about them. So you mentioned it. Middle schoolers they are concrete thinkers, and high schoolers are more abstract thinkers. Okay, so I think, I need something that takes whatever the idea is from the passage that can demonstrate it in a concrete way, as in it's here right in front of us. But then I think about, for a high school, I go, well, I want it to also still inspire something to the abstract. And normally I think about it with questions. You know, I lean more towards knowing how to communicate to middle schoolers and high schoolers. So I think, object for middle schoolers, that's great. But for our high schoolers that I was mostly speaking to, they really resonated with questions that made them ponder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So, I have this thing and it's physical for the middle schoolers, but now how can I leverage it to ask a question that really gets our high schoolers pondering? So that's like where I think through.
That's good
So
strategy.
That's me.
I love that strategy, Jamel, because it so often I feel like what middle schoolers need is the explanation of what, and high schoolers need the why. And when you give them the object lesson, that's the answer of the what. And then the why is the question. It's like a deeper philosophical thought.
I'll say this too. One of the kind of, moves, Kobe Bryant, his move was the fadeaway, right? One of my moves as a communicator is getting very personal, very vulnerable. I try to bring my scars and my pain almost into every talk or some type of personal illustration, whether I faced it as a middle school or high schooler, whether I'm facing it now, especially given, me having anxiety and sometimes occasional depression, finding personal stories from myself or even others, it lands the plane and it kind of reiterates that, man, this life is real. Man, this life hurts. And then getting it back to the scripture, back to the text, and then trying to land the plane with something like that. I'm very, very, let's go real to who I am, relevant to their situation, and reverent to God's word in such a way that stories and illustrations, like I said, those are my go-tos. But like you said, I think the way you phrase it, Jamel, was great. Is because like the object, it gets them thinking, and the questions gets high school students leaning in. And really when you have them leaning in, you know that you're engaging with them. So I appreciate the way you said that. But I will say like one of my go-to moves is just being very, very, very vulnerable in the way that I communicate to high schoolers and even middle schoolers.
Do you find sometimes this is just me pushing back
Come on.
that a little.
Yeah.
Is like, as a, I don't know how old you are, 20-something,
33.
30-something year old, like the things that like the scars that you carry or the pain that you carry, I mean, there definitely is a similarity to someone who's 12, but I'm thinking like, is it relatable always to a middle schooler?
Yeah.
Like, can they even wrap their head around a story about shame? Like, is there a process you go through when you're thinking about what stories you're going to share and how you're going to share them so that both age groups can relate?
The way I would answer that is I do think about it because I'm one of those guys that when I think about who's listening is that, if 85% of these middle schoolers might not get this story, there's still another 15% that might. And so for me, just because a middle school and high schooler has the generalities about them that they think those way, it doesn't mean they can't choose to think about it another way. And what I mean by that is, like, I've had plenty of middle schoolers come up to me on Sunday night or even at an event and say that was so relatable because middle schoolers go through some trauma as well. And so the way I look at that is if I'm being direct and I'm being real, and I believe that's the thing that I believe I needed to communicate, if I didn't overly think about it for them in terms of developmental, I at least know at least 2 or 3 of the middle schoolers are going to get it. Or if I communicate in such a way to a middle schooler that high schoolers might not always get it, there's still going to be a few high schoolers that get it. And so I'm also thinking about the 2 or 3 in there that might. You know what I'm saying? I think it's a great question.
I do get what you're saying. I just disagree.
Yeah, I get it.
I just can't imagine going into a talk saying, I think 85% of the middle schoolers are going to miss it. Like, I think I almost had a stroke right here.
Yeah.
Listening to that, you're like, no. I mean, I just disagree. I think, like, isn't there a way we can share stories that all of them could get it?
Yeah.
But
how do you know that they're also, my only pushback is, how do you know even using the middle school concept is getting to them? How do you know that?
That's true.
Is it by interviewing every single one of them after a talk? Is it because sometimes as communicators, especially as professional communicators, we can be big on, because every single one of you know how to communicate. Obviously, you have a platform to do so. Sometimes my pushback to even some of the general concepts, because I agree with 99% what's in your book. I don't disagree with you. I think more so for me to, because I think everyone listens and hears differently. I truly believe that somebody's gonna get it, and not everybody listens or hears the same message the same way. And so that's why sometimes I default to that. Is because, man, if there's 400 people in a room, I don't want to assume that I know exactly how they're receiving a message.
That's true.
Sometimes a middle schooler is going to be low on their phone. You think you're not listening. They're either taking notes or by playing a game, they're listening.
Yep.
And so I try to give the benefit of the doubt there. At the same time, your book and Orange does a great job of backing it up with science of where they are developmentally. And sometimes I try to squash the box by saying, no, they can get it. They can get it. And sometimes I can be more of an optimist than I am in terms of that and in that manner or whatever. But I think it's strong pushback. Sometimes my mind, is black and white, and then the 8 in the director in me is like, no, they're going to get it. They're going to get it. Just because I've had middle schoolers come up to me and say, I got it.
No, and you're right. Probably a lot of middle schoolers, right? And some high schoolers might not,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like for, a across the board thing for sure. But I've seen some really great communicators, like when they know they're sharing a story like that you're like hoping hits 50% in the room, let's say. They'll follow it a lot of times with, maybe for you, and they give like 2 or 3 other examples.
Right.
or something like that. So like, even if you know there's a chance not every kid in the room can relate to this, helping them connect the dots to what it might look like in their life or outside of that specific example will help, especially middle schoolers, take what you just explained in that story and put that same concept or principle in context of another life situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes I think through, all right, I have this experience now, and I'm 33 as a 33-year-old man. But now, what did I have a similar experience when I was 13-year-old boy? We'll call myself. So if it can downshift, that's the right word. If it can translate from 33-year-old Jamel to 13-year-old Jamel, then that's a decent test of like if the same thing works. Sometimes it doesn't, and we know there's more filters. We're speaking kind of generally ourselves. Yet I normally lean towards, depending on how you create your talks, right? If you have this idea that you want to communicate from the passage, I go, okay, so is there a situation in 13-year-old Jamel's life that meets that or illustrates that? Or is there a story from 13-year-old Yuto's life in my youth ministry that kind of relates to that? Of course, you ask the permission, stuff like that. But so I feel like I normally go to, how did 13-year-old Jamel experience this? Is there a story that can bring from there?
That's
or did 16-year-old Jamel experience this and kind of go from there?
Yeah, and I'll even say to your point, Ashley, because one thing that I find as a communicator that I will do is say, hey, 6th and 8th graders, I want you to hear this, right? And I'll say something that relates to them. It's not that I'm not thinking about it. I think sometimes I just look at it as, you know what, and it's an area I'm growing, and as communicators, we're never done growing. And one of the things, like I said, I've learned from you is to think those things through. And then sometimes even as a communicator, when you're teaching so much during the week, whether that's traveling or on Sundays, sometimes it can be hard to sit down and even process exactly what a 13-year-old is thinking in that moment. So sometimes the balance of even trying to do that,
Totally.
and then once again, overcompensating for that with your natural ability rather than absolutely thinking about where they are developmentally. It's not that I never think about it. Sometimes I'm just getting in my head of, I don't want to say that everyone's thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
But like you said, but no matter what, I want to get better at thinking through that. You know what I'm saying?
I'm coming to you in a second, Les. So
Okay.
just giving you the heads up. But I was going to say, you just mentioned a really important principle, I think, when it comes to communicating to a combined room, is there's one way of thought of thinking, like, share a story that they can all relate to.
Right.
And there are things that every person can relate to. They can relate to fights with friends.
Right.
They can relate to a holiday. They can relate to like things like that. Things that maybe only high schoolers can relate to are driving a car or taking an SAT or going to prom or dating or having social media, like those kind of things. So like you can pick something that everybody can relate to. But when you don't, I love what you said. You said 6th to 8th grade, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. I want you to hear this. Or maybe for you, it looks like this. And directly telling the room who you're talking to, as long as you're not talking down to them at all.
Right.
I think that's so huge. And I don't want anybody to miss that principle because that is so good.
And that's what I naturally default to. You know what I'm saying? If I'm not overly being specific exactly where they're all the time.
And I'll say real quick, that's my favorite strategy. Maybe we'll come back to it, but I just want to say that's my favorite. Hey, middle schoolers, I want you to think of it this way.
Right.
Yo, high schoolers, but what about this way for y'all? That's my favorite.
That's good. It's a good strategy.
Straight up.
Les, I want to hear what you're thinking over there.
I'm just trying to learn. I think communicating to a combined group is so challenging. And like in my own experience, and I have a question for y'all that I'm going to pitch back at y'all, but communicating to a smaller group of combined students to me feels easier than communicating to a larger group of combined students. So I'm curious, like when you look out into the audience and it's more of a situation where there's a sea of faces versus individual people. I'm curious, in your experiences, would you, if you had to pick, which I don't think there's a wrong or right answer, I'm just curious your preferences. If you had to communicate to a combined room, what's your sweet spot number of like in the audience, would you say?
Ooh. Well, for me, it depends on if I know the audience or not.
Let's say you don't know the audience.
Okay,
that's
a good problem. Yeah. So my thing is, if my sweet spot is, I would say 30. That seems to be right here. Because if it's less than that, then I feel like an overwhelming thing that like, I should know you. Like I should know who you are. I should be able to ask you and figure out. And I do my best to when I can until I figure out, hey, what do you like? Things like that. And if it's that's small and I don't know that, then for some reason I feel uncomfortable. But if it's 30, it's like just enough that like, okay, like can't know everybody's story here, and I feel better about speaking in more generalities. So I would say that's like my sweet spot about 30 for that reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Ash?
I don't even know how to answer the question.
I know.
I'm like,
Oh, no, I'm
You
thinking
can,
about
you
it.
can tweak the question. Okay, here's even
Yeah.
I'll color it in. There's a I'll just keep pitching different kinds of questions. You could either answer, what's your sweet spot number if you're speaking to a combined group? Maybe another question might be, if you are speaking to a combined group, would you prefer there are more middle schoolers or more high schoolers? Like if it had to skew a certain way in that way. And then maybe a third question might be, how you craft your bottom line or the main point change depending on the room, which I know that's a lot. I'm just trying to give
we
you
should
things
talk about
to
all of
answer.
those things. We should talk about all of
Great
those.
You can pick
questions.
one or none.
I mean, I don't
yeah.
know how to answer the number thing. I do think the smaller the room, whether it's combined or not, the harder it is to communicate. And I think that the more important it is that you know the people in the room, the smaller the room is. Because you cannot know a room with a sea of faces, and the energy comes from the room, not from the person leading the room, if that makes sense, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I like all sizes to communicate to.
Yeah.
But I like high schoolers, but I love middle schoolers.
Yeah.
That's real.
I mean, like,
That's why your
I-
first book was to middle schoolers.
yeah, exactly. So I feel like, to be honest, I think every single one of us needs to be honest with, we all lean one way.
Right.
We
I agree.
either lean like we
Yeah.
prefer middle school or we prefer high school.
And
And
we
the
all have
reason it's
favorite
important
children.
to admit that is because it's important to have somebody else help you balance yourself if you're
Right.
communicating to a room full of. I literally do not know how it's possible to love both equally. I understand you can value both
Right,
equally,
right.
but like,
So good.
which one do you lean towards? That's,
Yeah.
I think it's. What about you guys?
I think like I don't know how to answer number either. As I've grown up as a communicator, I've always had this like, if there are 10 people here or 1,000 people here, I'm going to be the same communicator. And I agree with Ashley. I don't think you can. I think you got to switch it up. Like I found over time that with a smaller, intimate crowd, I'm probably going to do more teaching, and with a bigger crowd, it's probably going to be more preaching style to continue to hold a larger audience, captive. And so that's how I would answer that. Sometimes, I think it also depends on the context. When you kind of speak to a bunch of athletes, as opposed to middle school and high schoolers on Sunday nights, as opposed to 6 generations on Sunday morning, you have your same style, you just change it up. And so I think it just depends. But I'm like you, Ashley. Like I often will ask, not for the sake of any kind of braggadocious stuff, but like, hey, how many am I communicating to when I go travel to an event? Because I know my Sunday night what I'm communicating to. I ask about an event more to know, okay, is it going to be 75 people? Is it going to be 7,500 people? Is it going to be 700 people? Is it going to be 50 people? That way I can kind of tailor what I'm doing. So I've grown more in understanding that, no, you're not going to yell at 10 people like you would at 1,000. Right? giving, and I'll even say like going to, leaning one way. You said, would you rather have high school or middle schoolers in the room? I truthfully, you asked this at Orange Conference this past April, and you said, how many of you love middle schoolers? And people stood up. You said, how many of you prefer high schoolers? I'm that guy who prefers high schoolers. I love hanging out with middle schoolers more. Does that make sense? Like I love hanging out with them more, but I love speaking to high schoolers more. It's crazy. I don't know how to explain it.
I feel it's probably similar.
But also, I also love challenging the high schoolers to love the middle schoolers.
Right.
I like using high schoolers as an example when I'm communicating to say, hey, seniors, you see that 8th grader? He's not just a pest that smells like onions and ketchup. He's a person to love. You know what I'm saying? It kind of just helps them see themselves as leaders. And so, but yeah, I would say high schoolers more than middle schoolers. I did ask Ashley, you need to write communicating to high schoolers next.
Nah, because every book is communicating to high schoolers. Every youth ministry book
That
about
is true. There's
communicating
not
is
many out
communicating to
there
high
like that.
schoolers.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's
And I say that
You
as a
can say
person.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I say that as a person who loves middle schoolers.
Straight
And
up.
as I read all of the books, and browse them, like, oh, this is talking about high schoolers. And I think that's kind of where student ministry like leans. It leans towards like prioritizing high schoolers.
Yeah.
And what I love about this book, and then also resources that are tailor-made specifically to middle schoolers, is that I think it gives a voice and a perspective towards middle schoolers that is really helpful and beneficial.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I want to hear more of like, tell us why you're asking these questions and where your brain is as you're.
I'm just
rethinking it.
processing.
Yeah.
I would say I can think of 2 talks where I was invited to, it's probably a room of maybe 250, which I would say is a big room for youth ministry. And those were like two of my least favorite talks to give. The room was combined. One of them was combined middle schoolers, high schoolers, but it was mostly middle schoolers. Like it skewed young. And I felt very disoriented of just like, all right, my notes are not going to work for this talk. You know what I mean? But we're going to give it anyway, right? It was one of those talks where I was
crawling
just like,
around on the floor under the stage.
I mean, and it was like, I don't know. It was a lot. It was a lot. And it was a lot, not because of the students. It was, maybe you all have this moment when you're communicating and you can tell that like what I prepared is not going to connect, right? Or the thing I thought was going to be the landing point is not going to be the landing point, right? And so like you're in real time editing and basing off the feedback of the crowd. So it's just challenging. So that was one. And then another time, the topic I was given was a huge topic that I was like, I would never, it was a room of middle schoolers. And I was like, I would never talk to middle schoolers about, justification. It was like it's like sin and justification. Yeah, that was the word in the teaching notes that they gave me in the script, and I was just like, how do you do this? How do you do this, right? So I'm like trying to pull song lyrics we just sang in worship, and I'm trying to like tie it to things that are. It's like, how do you explain justification to a room of middle schoolers? So I think that's also
if you
part
know,
of it.
drop it in the comments because
It's
we
in
would
Ash-
love to.
Learn from you.
It's in
Yeah.
Ashley's book.
Yeah, I probably
She has a word converter in there.
Yeah.
Yes,
I would have
Dead
rewritten the
serious.
talk. I would have
Yes, I
tried to
would've used
rewrite
it.
the talk. Yeah, totally. So
That's funny.
I don't know. So yeah, I think it is challenging. It is a unique challenge. I prefer a smaller room because I probably lean more on authenticity and eye contact, and I can make a call in the moment of like, all right, turn and talk, you with you. You know, that kind of room is probably I am more of a facilitator and I want to lead through an activity. I want to teach a little bit, turn and talk a little bit. I want to show video. Like I want to do something more interactive, which doesn't always work in the larger rooms. It can work if you plan ahead, but yeah. So I'm like even just trying to figure out how this works in my life as a communicator.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
You also asked a good question about the difference in a middle school and a high school, like bottom line or a sticky statement or a big idea or the point or whatever you call it in your context. Like how we think about the point of our message or the bottom line of our messages. I would love to hear what you boys think.
Yeah. For me, it's all about word choice. And I'm like, I wouldn't call myself I'm an aspiring wordsmith. That's what we're going to say. And so I feel as though the words that we use, especially between middle schoolers and high schoolers, are really important. I think they're important no matter who you are, what age, but especially with middle schoolers and high schoolers, because certain words are just better for the middle school developmental place. And we're not saying that middle schoolers are stupid or dumber than high schoolers. We're saying that they just have a different word bank in their minds that needs to be accessed. So without being more specific than that, like that's the most important thing for me. All right, what words do I choose for the middle schoolers in the room? What words would I choose for the high schoolers in the room? When it's combined, here's something that I'll say. Here's like a tidbit. And you were the first person I heard say this, Ashley, so let me know if this is like your phrase or not. But it's the idea that if we're thinking about their brain development, like what their brain has actually done, every person, if it's a middle school, high school room, every person in the room has been a middle schooler. You hear me? Either they're a middle schooler now or they were in the past. So everyone in the room can think like a middle schooler, whether it's accessing how they think now or thinking back a few years. But only the high schoolers in the room have been high schoolers. You know what I'm saying? So I sometimes lean towards, if it's combined, I word it more middle school like, because the middle schoolers can understand it and the high schoolers can think back to it. So that's kind of
I was
where
not
I
the first
think,
person who said that. Somebody, I can't remember who said it
I want to
first.
give them credit because
But it was someone
my
smarter
mind.
than me. I just repeated it.
Okay, tight. But
Can't take credit.
You're great. So to summarize that, if it's thinking about bottom lines, I think about what words either work best for both, or I get specific, and sometimes I go either way. So wording is the most important thing for me.
What do you
for
guys
bottom
think
lines.
about that?
About bottom
As
line.
people who lean towards high school, hearing Jamel saying, I lean towards middle school and how I word my bottom lines in a combined room.
Yeah, this might be a hot take, but I do think bottom lines are probably, what am I trying to say? I think the communicator themselves has to know what kind of communicator they are to land the kind of bottom line. Some communicators need to land a different.
I totally agree.
I mean, there's certain bottom lines I can't land because they are not authentic to my voice.
Got
and
it.
so even if I'm probably going to lean more toward an abstract, compelling, like whatever those words are, and I'm going to use the 3,000 other words to make it clear. But the bottom line is
Got
something
it.
I want you to take with you, that I feel like when I say it, I feel the passion of it.
Yes.
Versus when it's like, and here's the bottom line, and then it's just like a sentence. I feel like I have to repeat it a lot of times because I feel like I have to get my own emotions into it to put. So I think it depends on the communicator.
I understand that.
Yeah.
I
You
do.
know, you
So
have to
good,
be able
man.
to deliver it.
So then correct me if I'm misunderstanding you. Are you saying that sometimes the bottom line might be more about the communicator than maybe the crowd? Not in like a selfish way, but like, is that thing? Am I understanding you correctly?
I
Or
think
how would you
if
correct me?
the word we're talking about is communicating, not just talking at.
Yes.
There's some bottom lines I can communicate. Like I know I can take you through the loops and the ups and downs and land you at this bottom line or whatever. I can craft this bottom line to communicate it to you. There are other bottom lines I just have to say because it's like if I didn't write it and it was assigned to me and I just have to say whatever the words are that I would have probably never really chosen to say this in this way. And so I guess I'm saying a communicator has to know their style and at what point in your talk is your bottom line coming, because at that point you want to be your most passionate self. You want to be the person who is selling this bottom line and making sure that the bottom line, I will just say this, as a person who leans more abstract and creative, making sure your bottom line does not distract from what you really want them to take home, right?
Got
And
it.
so using the 3,000 words to be very clear and applicable and all that. So,
That's some
okay.
good
Yeah,
bottom
that's
line
good.
technique
It's good
right
hot
there.
take.
Big time.
Okay.
I like it.
That's not even a hot take. I wouldn't say it's a hot take.
I don't know.
That's just helpful, and I'm gonna keep that.
Man.
That's really good.
Cool.
So good. Yeah, I find, and Brene Brown says it, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. I think for a bottom line, especially something you're trying to land, I agree with you. I think sometimes it has to do more with the communicator than the crowd, because there's been bottom lines I've used, whether that be from an Orange curriculum or another book that I tried to land, but it didn't feel like it was me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll either take those bottom lines and kind of griffify it. I just made that word up. I've never said that before.
Griffify.
It's a good word. It's a
You know
good
what I'm
word.
saying?
I like it.
I'll probably forget about it. But anyway, and so I try to make it as clear as possible, as simple as possible. Sometimes I might even, and I more so do this when I travel, is I kind of come up with two bottom lines. And what I mean is it's the same thing, but it's communicated. Hey, high school, this, and middle school, this. I've done that before, and it's worked.
Yeah.
I will say, so let me just use Mark Batterson's book, Grave Robber. Grave Robber. That's not the book of the, yeah. Grave Robber, he says, and his big bottom line for that book is, you're impossible. God can make your impossible possible. The student version of that is your impossible is God's I've got this. Right? It kind of communicates well. And ever since I read that book, we did it as a study as a church, it's kind of helped me craft simplistic bottom lines that, like you said, you kind of wordsmith. What's cool about even bottom lines, and I know y'all as communicators do this, sometimes it can take 30 seconds to land up, to come up with a bottom line that just hits both. And then sometimes it can take 15 days. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes the craft of communication is so hard, because sometimes, what I do, going back to what you even said about if it's the communicator or the crowd, I can tend to overthink. And I find when I overthink a bottom line, I feel like I'm gonna lose it. I feel like I'm not gonna land it well.
That's so fair.
You know what I'm saying? Because
Yeah.
sometimes I can be decisive. No, this is what I'm gonna say, and it can be the most simplistic thing. I'm just gonna say it. And other times I'm like, I think I'm making this way too complicated. And so in the middle of communicating to combined rooms, because that's all I do. I don't think I've ever just communicated to just middle schoolers or just high schoolers. Most of the time it's both. It's trying to find that simplicity.
Yeah.
It's trying to find something that has alliteration, that's something that's catchy, that hits them both. But I'll be real, I wouldn't say that I'm always an expert at doing it to both. I just try to find the most simplistic way possible, the words that are going to rhyme a little bit to try to hit them. But I think sometimes I can overthink it as a communicator. You might even talk about it in your book. But Doug Fields has a book, Communicating to Teenagers. By the way, your book reminded me of Doug Fields' book in a lot of ways. I thought it was on that same level of trying to craft a bottom line. And sometimes I look at some of the things you've said in your book, Ashley, and I'm like, how did she come up with that? And it may have been 30 days, it may have been 30 minutes, it may have been 30 seconds. And sometimes I'm comparing my bottom lines to others. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's just something as communicators we're always going to work on. But I do agree that sometimes it is based on the communicator more than it is about the crowd and how you land it.
If I may affirm something in here, and I didn't say it in my introduction, but I actually work for Orange. I'm on the Orange students, I'm part of the curriculum team. You said something in there that's really important that I think a lot of our partners, if you use our curriculum, don't always fully know. That you say that you, even if it's from Orange curriculum, you griffify it, right? That still sounds good.
So it's word generator. It's
Yeah,
your
yeah.
own word
Boom.
generator.
Your own word generator. So
Boom.
I want to say, because I work, I talk with partners and go like, I'm just not sure if I can say it like this way. Then change it.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is probably the greatest misconception about
Yes.
all curriculum, and maybe
Big time.
and so therefore Orange
time.
curriculum as well. You should Griffify, Lesliefy, Jamelify, Ashleyify, Johnify, Marquisify, like whatever your name is, ify it, the bottom lines, because we know and we write the curriculum knowing that you're the final editor. Your context is more important than the way specifically that we worded it. And so whatever you need to do to contextualize it, to make it work for your students, you should feel freedom to do that and our blessing.
Absolutely.
And it's the
Amen.
entire
Absolutely.
reason we include editable files.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In everything.
Exactly.
Straight up.
Exactly.
Is
Straight
for
up.
that reason. for
Exactly.
sure.
Yeah. That's so good.
So
man.
I love that. And so we should all ify at the bottom lines when needed.
Yeah.
Man, I'm like,
Solid.
I'm deep in my thoughts about this because I could argue with myself.
Big time.
Like, I can argue multiple sides of this conversation just specifically on bottom lines or sticky statements or big ideas or whatever you call them. Because I feel like I understand the value of it being compelling. You want a middle and a high schooler to like care about what you're
Yeah.
saying, and be motivated to like change or do something with the information. And like at the same time, not the opposite, because you can be compelling and clear.
Right. That's a sweet spot.
Yeah, I'm like,
up.
if you could be
Big time.
compelling and clear,
Big
oh,
time.
That's the goal.
like who has time to do that? But
Yeah.
I don't know. Let
Who
us
has
know
time?
if you're a
Bruh.
word generator like that. But I feel like for at least in the middle school space, I would say like sometimes when the bottom line isn't clear, and I feel like middle schoolers are more forgiving, and if it's not sexy or compelling or fancy, like they're just like, what exactly are you saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of times when it's not clear, I spend so much time, every time I mention anything about that truth, I have to say it, like I have to re-explain what it means because they've already, from 2 minutes ago forgotten what I meant, and they can't repeat it then. Or they can't explain to somebody else what it means. And another filter I always think through is if I posted this bottom line on social media and a middle schooler was scrolling, they hadn't been at the event,
Wow.
would they know what that means?
Oh,
Wow.
snap. I've never
And would it
really
make
thought
them
That's a
about
even
great
want to
question,
be
man.
part of this? Like,
Wow.
does it speak to them in a way
Yeah.
that makes them feel seen, makes them feel known, and makes them feel like they can belong to this thing
Yeah.
because they understand what that means?
Wow.
Huh.
yeah.
It's a great question.
Yeah, and I would say even
Wow.
for people who lean more creative or whatever with words, I think trying to figure out how to land in the sweet spot of both, you know what I mean? I think just because it's clear doesn't mean that it's default boring, and just because it's creative doesn't mean that it's unclear. You know what I mean? So I think
Yes.
every person has to fight for clarity, regardless of if you're going, it's going to be clear because it's straightforward, or it's going to be clear because it's memorable, or whatever the thing is. I think fighting for clarity, like it needs to matter. If it's your bottom line, it
Yes.
really should be able to matter in the grand scheme of the talk. So
Yeah. I think one thing I've heard before said in different ways is it, when you're thinking about a bottom line or whatever you're trying to say, a point, is it meaningful? Is it meaningful? Is it memorable? And can it move you to action? Can you move you to action? One of the things, even going off what you just said, Ashley, about, you ever post something, you think this is going to be the quote that people are going to love. Nobody loves it. And then you post something else and everybody loves it. Well, I find even with middle school and high schoolers, man, obviously, man, trends, I'm fascinated where trends start. Right now, one of our trends at Bayou students, y'all know who Shawn Michaels is. He was a WWE superstar.
Yes.
His finishing move was the super kick. And there's this video
I
on
remember.
Instagram right now where he asks this guy his name and he's like, Stan, and he super kicks him. Right now, I'm literally going around the whole place just fake super kicking kids.
Oh, snap.
The middle schoolers are obsessed with it. And they go around and just act like they're super kicking kids. And I'm like, man, I want to make, like you said, I want to make a bottom line that sticky. right? To where it's
yeah.
so like you just either say it a lot, or maybe you take a bottom line you said from a message and it becomes like an anthem in your student ministry, especially from the week to week. And it, because I think of even athletes. When I was at UL's campus the other day, and they just have phrases all around the room. So I'm wondering, and y'all probably even talk about this as Orange team, is taking those bottom lines you've said and making them sticky and sticking them around the room and helping them remind it, even if it's simple as it is. Because I think sometimes when it comes to overthinking, I'm like, is this deep enough? Is this going to hit enough? Is this going to speak like Ashley does? You know what I'm saying? Is this going to hit like Jamel? Is this going to hit like Leslie? Like sometimes you can get so comparative in what bottom lines hit like other bottom lines. Like Reggie will drop a bomb at conference. You're like, what the heck, man? You're like, well, he's had all year to think about it. But anyway, listen, I'm just kidding. No, he's great.
But craft bottom lines.
So and even
He's
going
good
back
at
to absolutely. Even when go back to even you pushing back for something I said, I think what I tend to do too is sometimes pride gets to you, right? You're like, nah, man, I'm just an effective communicator. They're gonna hear it. They're gonna hear it. Instead of doing the work and humility to try to craft something that's going to hit them developmentally. And a lot of times overthinking happens.
Yeah.
It's that overthinking that continues to drive me crazy as a communicator because you want it to be perfect.
Yeah, it makes me think of we've kind of started this thing in the Orange curriculum called an annual focus. I'm not going to put y'all on the spot, but I would say to anyone listening, who can remember one line from last week's sermon or from 3 weeks ago sermon or the best, if you think of 52 weeks worth of content, who can remember the one line? Nobody really. There might be 3 or 4 out of a year that stick. And so I think it is a place for us to say, okay, yes, this one talk, this one night, or this one opportunity, I'm going to make the most of it with a really great statement. But to look at a bigger picture of say, what's the thing I want them to be able to hang their life on for the year? And so in the curriculum with Orange, we have started doing an annual focus, which says, at the end of the day, this one thing we're going to come back to all year long, whether you come twice this year or once this year or 52 times this year. Here, it's kind of like a Christmas tree, and all the other bottom lines are basically the ornaments that you hang around it. Ooh. But I really just want you to remember the Christmas tree statement, right? The one thing is that, so one year it was, Jesus changes everything. So every talk landed somewhere with that phrase. Where did you see God today? Helping people look for God in their everyday lives. And then we had a phrase every day. And so there's just all these opportunities to say, no one's going to really remember the week to week. Do the best. Yes, it is worth it to still craft the bottom line, but look at the bigger picture. What's the one message for the year that they can hear so often that it becomes a part of how they're living their lives?
So good, man.
So,
can I give one more tool?
Please.
That I try to do? So I know for us, man, one thing that I always try to teach our middle schools and high school students, especially on Wednesday nights for our internship, is what I like to say before every talk is, hey, I believe note takers are change makers, and when you write it down, you're more inclined to walk it out. And over time, the consistency of that phrase and the consistency of showing them how to take notes, they might not remember it off the top of their head, but if they write it down, they might. You know what I'm saying? When you write stuff down, man, it changes everything. And so we've seen, man, like a lot of middle school and high schoolers bring their notepads, bring their Bibles, and they're literally taking notes because they heard, well, I guess if I write it down, I might look at it. And it's so cool towards the end of the year when you go back with those interns or even, and they're showing you things. Hey, because we do a lot of recap stuff. So it's like, hey, what is something that Hayden said last week? What is something that one of your mentors said? So we're teaching them, not even in the act of the stage communication, but you should be writing stuff down your mentor said. What does your small group leader said? Because I've got notebooks piled with things that I remember.
Good.
So that's a tool that I always try to give other communicators as well. Hey, have your students take notes. Like, it's mandatory for our interns. You know what I'm saying? Not your phone,
awesome.
your note. Like, bring a notebook. You're more, and so anyway, that's a tool that I always try to give, is that when you write it down, you probably walk it out.
I love
Quick
that.
tool.
Creating a culture of note takers, eh?
Culture
We
of note
could
takers.
probably talk
I
about
know.
this for another 5
Part 2.
hours.
So we can, right?
There will
Part 2.
definitely be future episodes on communicating to middle and high schoolers. I think there's a lot of angles of this conversation that we need to tackle in the future. But I would just say that I think we can all agree. We may not all agree on everything here, but what we can all agree on is it is possible to communicate well to a combined room of middle and high schoolers.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It just requires a lot of
more
work.
work.
Lot.
And if you
Yes.
haven't even thought about it, our challenge to you is to think about, what do my high schoolers need? What do my middle schoolers need? And if you tend to lean towards high school or you tend to lean towards middle school, who do you have in your life who can help you think through the side you don't lean towards, so you make sure you can be as inclusive? Because I don't have to convince you, if you're listening or watching, that what you're saying is important. Like, you do what you do because you know you have the most important message on the planet. And we just want to help youth leaders, and we all want to keep getting better at making sure we're communicating the best, most important message on the planet in a way that middle and high schoolers can hear it and can live it out. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for rethinking this topic with us. We would love to know if there's anything you're rethinking. Please reach out, DM us at Orange Students, and we'll talk to you soon.